welcome to another episode of Perspective Checks here on the Rene Plays Games podcast, where I sit down with friends and folks from the TTRPG community to talk about the things we love, or drive us crazy, or just occupy our brains about this hobby that we all share and love. And this episode feels weird to be introducing this so formally, because when I say friends and folks from the TTRPG community, I mean Christian here is a friend that I've been friends with. We started playing RPGs together on the internet, started with a local library program, and now we're just nerds on the internet, and it feels weird to be doing this so formally with you, bud.
It does. Yeah, usually we've come a long way. We're semi-professional now.
So, yeah, I would stress the semi, but
extremely semi, yeah.
But yeah, Christian from DMs After Dark, and
hello.
Yeah, how you doing, man? What's up?
I'm doing good, man. How are you doing?
Good. You've been busy.
I have been. Yeah, I have been. It's we're continuing to stream DMs After Dark, as you said. We're doing RuneQuest right now, which will tie in a little bit probably to what we're talking about today.
For sure.
Probably a lot, actually.
Yeah.
And recently released my third scenario for Call of Cthulhu that's professionally published, Deadfellas, on the Miskatonic repository. It's been doing really well. We're, as of the time of recording right now, very close to copper, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Drive-through RPGs is a notoriously low-selling affair, so to get any sort of traction there is great at all, and it's been very well received. Actually was streamed by some people in Australia. They picked it up and streamed it, which was so cool, and honestly quite an experience to see your stuff, to be on the other end, and be someone who has created something, watching other people like stream it, which right now I get to say publicly, I apologize to all the people whose games we've streamed, because yeah, especially the people who wrote Grandma's Club. I definitely apologize to them.
No, listen, Grandma Club, they can hang their hat on being like, maybe like people around the world maybe played our game. Whoever wrote Grandma Club, people have played your game and they've done it right, but nobody's going to ever play Grandma Club like we did.
No, they probably shouldn't.
But yeah, dude, congrats. I will obviously link Deadfellas in the description of the podcast.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yeah.
I would like to think that. If not, I just feel...
Oh, you definitely played a part. Yes.
A strong connection to any mafia-related scenario.
You were there heart and soul with me as I was writing it. 100%. Yeah. Yep.
Because, if and when I write my own Call of Cthulhu scenario, now I don't have to, because the Mafia is written for me. You did it.
The mob is a staple. A lot of times it's the 20s mob because of the classic period, but
the era,
like bootleggers and their rum runners and stuff. That's still you've got plenty of space to work there still when you write your own.
Yeah, and like you're right, and plus I can tie my wetland shit into it, like everyone knows I always do, because they used to hide stuff in the marshes.
So they're going to throw dead guys in the marshes. Yeah, it works.
And then what's coming out of those dark waters, man? What's coming out?
God knows why. It's something with tentacles.
All right. Well, okay, we got to do the formal thing here real quick.
We do.
And I always ask the same 3 questions at the top of the episode.
Sure.
And if people have been listening to DMs After Dark, we've answered this on multiple old modified roles, and people engage with you in Twitch chat and stuff all the time. But for those of you who, for some reason, are finding you first here, Christian, how long have you been playing TTRPGs?
I don't want to do the math right now, but I will say that it was 93 or 4, which puts me probably in like the second generation of gamers. Like I'm not one of the people who played like when it first came out, but by the time I started playing AD&D, second edition was the thing. We started with like Redbox D&D, basic and expert set that was still on the market, but moved pretty quickly on to, I basically was around for like the tail end of second edition at the time when they had all the really awesome campaign settings and were just churning out great stuff, and that like Planescape and everything, and then picked up third edition. So that was that's when I started. So that's 30 some odd years ago.
Yeah, and what's cool is I feel like you're right. Like I like the idea of talking about it in generations like that. Like obviously, occasionally you're going to meet those people who are like, I've been playing since the early 80s, like 70s or whatever, when it was initially a thing. But I feel like I talked to somebody about this recently where like if you think about like the RPGs by decade, right? Like there's been these like massive changes every time. But like starting from like the 90s, early 90s, right? Where like the 80s had a lot of IP games that were trying to just do, like TSR was even making IP games that weren't D&D.
Totally. Yeah.
But they were like weird and not necessarily great compared to IP that's been done lately. Mm-hmm. But then there was like the 90s was like really edgy. Mm-hmm. The edgelord decade.
Yeah, White Wolf.
Yeah, and then the 2000s was like the internet boom, right? Like the Forge and all that stuff. And then the 2010s was like when indie just exploded.
Yep.
So you've gotten to see quite a bit of it.
Yeah, I have.
And now we play all kinds of games on the internet because there's just too many.
Literally what we do. There's not enough to do in my lifetime, which
we'll
is
never
a great
catch
thing.
up.
Honestly, I love it. It's a great thing. And it's interesting too, because I like to think that we're at a time period too now that like a lot of these, like D&D has its 50th anniversary. Chaosium is having its 50th anniversary this year. The designers of those games, Gygax is dead. Ernie Gygax just passed away today, so rest in peace to him.
Did he really?
That was his son.
Man.
Yeah, he passed away.
R.I.P.
That was his son. And, Greg Stafford has passed away, Chaosium.
Yep.
And so we're beginning to lose those first-generation gamers.
Janelle Jacquet, she recently passed, right? Like last year or the year before?
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's I'm glad to see that this is not any way related to what we're talking about today, but like people like Shannon Appleseed out there who are doing the work of like preserving the history of those games and like kind of the stories behind it, how they got made and the companies and all that sort of stuff, because that stuff gets lost, and as you get older, you begin to realize that, I think, and have more perspective over it, and I'm really happy to see that happening. So that's all.
Yeah, I think that you're right, though. This is way off topic for what we're talking about today. But you're right. There is kind of like a budding like history aspect to this. Like people who are like chronicling like all those games that like didn't sell well even in the 80s, but like they exist somewhere, There's even a new person out there, M. Friedman, who's a professor down at Auburn, and she's already she's already doing like actual play history and cataloging, and it's really cool.
That. It's the weirdest thing. I mean, we actually, I know the next question is kind of like where can you find us, right? Or what have we been playing lately? What have we been playing lately very publicly is RuneQuest, right? On
very old game
on stream on DMs After Dark, very old game, and there's a guidebook basically that's somebody put out community content of like everything that's made for RuneQuest, right? Like people who make T-shirts, artwork, whatever, and it blew my mind when I found us in that, like listed as an actual play, because I never had considered us like, you don't think of that when you're doing something like this. You're just like, I'm doing this thing because I'm cool, and now you're like part of it, and that book is out there, and 20, 30 years from now, some dork historian will be like, oh, DMs After Dark, but it could be a college professor, right? And it's like, that's just weird. It's a weird feeling, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and what's funny? This does actually
wish
segue.
I'd been a little more serious sometimes on stream.
No, but you know what? But that's also the nature of games, though.
Yeah, it is true. It's true. Yeah.
I can't think of a single AP that is like all drama all the time and no at the table laughs, and it shouldn't be,
and it never should be, because it's. I think personally, like, I want to see games played as they're played, and as they're played is people goofing around and making dick jokes at on screen. And so
there's actually been a lot of discourse about this recently, about like actual plays as like sitting down and like hearing people play the game and not cutting all the chaff of like table talk and rules and stuff like that, versus like actual plays as performance pieces. And like I think both are equally valid and serve different purposes depending on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think there's a kind, like, the really well designed ones, or like you said, the performance ones are more akin to something like an old school radio drama or something like that, right? And they're great, and I've enjoyed them. I personally, our own body of work tends much towards to be people actually playing games, but I'm a firm believer of like, when I started games, nobody was around to teach you how to do it. You just kind of learned how to do it, and you sat down and you did it, and you had every group book had that example of play thing written in it. And you're kind of like, okay, I guess this is how it works. But I think the space on that end is you have to serve an example for other people out there to see, like, you don't need to be a professional voice actor, and you don't need to have, a studio with great lighting and, thousands and thousands of dollars worth of Dwarven Forge stuff or whatever to have a really good time with your friends. And
you just got to be committed to the story, right? That's
exactly. And you know what? We wind up having those great moments too. It's just there's a lot of like, there's other nonsense around it. That's all.
Yeah. And you know what? Even for a game like RuneQuest, which has decades of like mythology and like incredible world building, like the setting is insanely deep. The ducks were a joke in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
And what's funny is, and you said this before, like it was crazy to see the DMs After Dark in that book of like things that RuneQuest has produced over the years of all of its many, many like pieces of merch and all of the different like books and things that have come out, fan submitted, whatever, and like writing and whatnot. And yet, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't want to like blow up your spot here, but early on in our first 6 seasons of Sartar campaign, you and Amber worked a lot on like Telmori stuff that there's still like a large gap in that.
Huge gaps and stuff that's just never been explored. Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. Never been explored, which is what kind of like what excites me about it. You know, I mean, I think when you look at, and again, this is not on topic either, but we'll get there eventually. Glorantha as a world is incredible, like you said, incredibly rich and deep and detailed, but there's so much room for you to add your own stuff in there too. Still.
And that means it's well designed. It's not stifling you in its detail, right?
Exactly. And I think that's probably what keeps people away from it, honestly, is like this kind of reputation of like, oh God, there's all this lore I'm going to have to learn. And, you know, if I'm running it and somebody knows it better than me and they're going to be like, that's not what happened or whatever. And, you know, first of all, I haven't found that. Like I was petrified when we started that that's what's going to happen. And I've never found that at all with the community themselves, despite me very publicly, you know, playing this game, but also, you know, there's if you look into it, there's enough room and space for you to add your stuff.
Yeah,
whatever stuff you want, it's in there. Yeah. So,
and actually, I think that is a good segue, Christian.
That's a perfect segue. Yes,
into what we're talking about today. So, yeah, what are we talking about?
Which will be sandbox settings and sandbox games.
Yes,
and I think the first step is to define that, right?
I think it's a pretty popular term in RPGs, but not everybody might know what we mean when we say sandbox. So how would you define a sandbox game?
Interesting. I would define it as a game where narrative control rests more in the hands of the players than the GM. I would say that, you know, if the typical game might be like 80-20 with the GM having like 80% of the control, the sandbox might be, I don't even know if it's exactly reversed. It might be like 60-40 or 70-30 in the favor of the players.
Yeah.
Because it reacts more to what the players want to do with the world, and the world itself is more reactionary to what the players do.
That's actually, you've surprisingly boiled that down to, I think, a really elegant and simple definition. If the two poles of that spectrum are sandbox and railroad, where a 100% railroaded game, which everybody knows, you know, and there's valid criticisms for, but not that there's not a time for, a 100% railroad game would be entirely in the hands of the DM, and you're just going through a ride. You're going through a planned experience. But the complete other end of the spectrum would be a GM sitting down and going, I know the rules, but you guys just tell me what you're doing. And that's 100% sandbox. And obviously, like you said, like most games are like 80-20 for GM control. Yeah. But if you think of a sandbox as like 60-40, 70-30 player narrative control, then that actually does make a lot of sense, right? There is a world. The DM has put in a good chunk of work to hopefully make it rich enough, interesting enough for you to engage with certain parts of it, but they're not pushing you any which way.
Right.
Yeah. And the metaphor of a sandbox is that, unlike a railroad, imagine just being dropped in the middle of a sandbox with a bunch of toys all over it, and you choose where to go.
You choose what you want to play with and how you want to play with it.
Yep. And when you move it and it shifts some sand and it reveals new things, or it, you know.
And I think that's the most attractive, for me, I think that's the most attractive thing about it, is what you just said, is like, the world reacts to what the players do. I think that's the most important part of it, right? Is that the world has to react to what the players do, and that's the experience that a sandbox can give that other games can't.
Yeah. And again, it can't be zero work by the GM, right? Because there needs to be forces in that world that are going to take an interest or be affected by the actions of the PCs in a way that then the GM now has narrative fuel to basically just use as consequences of actions, or just to provide new interesting things for them to potentially engage with. And if they don't,
you move on.
Those things will progress as they do.
Yeah, and I think it's a perfectly acceptable to, because I think that, you know, there's right now there's this like player agency is like a term that gets thrown out a lot, right? And sometimes I have my reservations about it, because I think sometimes I think it's used as the new version of like, it's what my player would do, or what my character would do, sort of thing, where, somebody tries to do something that would just wreck a game. And, in the old days, it used to be like, well, that's what my character would do. I would steal from the party. Nowadays, it's like, well, you're disrespecting player agency because you won't let me do this because I'm going to take away the fun for everyone else or I'm going to ruin your game. So I'm not saying that's like always the case. I just think sometimes I hear that term and I'm like, oh God, because players, sometimes the people I see using it, I'm like, well, yeah, what you're doing, like, it's not cool, man. There's a social contract at a gaming table too, and if you're violating it, I don't care about playing agency. If you're being a jerk, you're ruining everyone's fun, right? So I think to relate that back to sandboxes, I don't think that necessarily has to be a world or a game where the players can do anything or just like have free reign to do anything. You get to define a campaign and the setting and what's going on in the world as a GM, and their part of it is their reaction to it. They just get to react pretty much any way they choose. And I think the example I'll give, just because I'm doing it right now, and this is how the conversation came apart that led to me being here, is a running call Company of the Dragon.
Yep.
Which is a sandbox campaign for RuneQuest. But the setting and the backdrop is a war. It's a revolution. It's, the people of Sartar are trying to get the Lunar Empire out of their land. And so that's what's going on. The players who are in control of this company can make whatever plans they want to do to accomplish that goal, but there's still a goal and kind of a guideline for that campaign.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head too with like social contract obviously is something that it's what my player would do. Yeah, but we're all sitting here as players. Like what your character would do might be that really awful thing, but maybe don't do that because as a player, that the rest of the people at this table, you should respect them enough not to do that. Right? And like in a sandbox game where, like you said, you can do anything.
And the DM is one of those players.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And
equally
so,
beholden.
If you're disrespecting what he's prepared or they've prepared, you're violating the social contract.
Yeah. And but also the DM is one of those players that, I mean, they do have the role of the world and the adjudicator of rules, right? Which is why homebrewing and being like, we're going to make this ruling right now just because like this is a niche case or we don't have a quick answer in the book or whatever. You can say like, I'd rather you not do this because it's going to break everything and it's just going to make everybody's life and time a little worse, But yeah, I think that it's equal, you know what I mean? Like everyone shares in the responsibility to make sure everybody else, people at the table are having a good time.
I think, and this is the next thing to talk about, so we'll segue here because it's a good one.
Yeah.
What are common criticisms? I think one of them is that whole idea that we just covered of like, well, if the players can just do everything, then, then the GM just kind of becomes a servant who has to deal with, whatever nonsense the players come up with or whatever stupid thing they do. And they kind of like roughshod over what your world, quote unquote, right? For lack of a better term as a GM, like your game, whatever you've made. I think that's one common criticism. I think we just addressed that with the social contract. And I think, again, this goes back to very first episode of our podcast, right? When we were doing DMs After Dark, session 0, right? Let's have a good session 0. This is what this game is about. If you can't make a character that doesn't fit in this game, make another one that does, or don't play in it. And that's that. I think the other criticism would be that they can go nowhere.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the players don't know how to engage with it properly. A sandbox game.
Yep. It can be easy to lose the plot, right? As a player, being like, what are we doing again? Because there's so much to do. Maybe analysis paralysis is one of the parts of it.
Yep.
But I mean, like you said, the GM or the DM is also a player at that table. And one of their responsibilities is to nudge players and remind them that things are happening in the world that they should be focusing on.
That is exactly how to solve that problem that I found. When you're going to have, I don't want to call them like passive players, but you're going to have active players, and I'll call them like reactive players, right? So an active player will engage with the world and be like, this is what I want my character to do. I'm going to go out and do this. I want this scene. I want this to happen. Blah, 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 right? They'll tell you. They're not going to be shy. You're going to know who your active players are, right? They're going to engage very quickly. And then you're going to have reactive players who, like, you put something in front of them, they'll engage with it. But if you're like, okay, well, what do you want your character to do? They might not have that solid grasp of like what they want their character to do because they're more used to, they might have been playing in more traditional like D&D campaigns or sort of campaigns are designed like on rails, right? to some degree, where they're
set
just
piece
kind of
to set piece to set
piece, and you're given prompts and you just react to them. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. That can be really fun. But
for sure.
Yeah, for sure. But they might just be used to that style of play. The key is let the active players do their thing, give the reactive players things to deal with.
Yeah,
right.
That's actually really fun.
You have to know your players, right? And you just have to know, and if you're stuck, right? If you're really stuck, here's a good tip. The things the reactive players have to deal with are the consequences of the actions of your active players.
I was just going to say that. I was going to say,
scoop the water out of one ship and dump it in the other one and let them deal with whatever it is their active friends came up with. Right?
Yes, yeah. I was going to say, I just I had a conversation with someone recently about how important talking about the gameplay loop, the expected loop of a game goes to making sure that players know what to do and how to enjoy it. And in a sandbox, there really isn't one. That's kind of one of the nice things, right? There's no defined loop, right? Blades in the Dark has a very gather information, you know what I mean? It's free play, then it's score, then it's downtime, then it's free play. You know what I mean? And you follow that wheel all the time. In a sandbox, you don't have that. But I love that answer, which is just let the active player do something, and as soon as there's a consequence, shift to the reactive player and be like, how are you dealing with this?
What do you do about this, right? That's if you're stuck, right? But ideally also, I think there's a point that you made here where it's when you have things going on, always have at least one story thread applying pressure and one character arc in crisis mode. Make sure everybody has a thing, right?
Yeah.
Everybody, and if you watch, I think the best, I've said this before, role-playing games you can't compare them to film. A lot of people think of oh, we got to compare it to a movie, a story structure of a movie. The story structure of a movie is very different than what you're going to get out of a gameplay experience, because there's 3 solid acts in a movie, and there's, they know how to build the tension and arrive at a climax and everything. And that pacing is very hard to pull off in a campaign.
Right.
But what you can use as a very good guideline is any really good long-running TV series.
Agreed. So hard.
That's a campaign, right? And if you look at those episodes, right? If you watch one, pick one. I don't care. Just pick one you like and watch it, and watch what happens with the characters. Anyone that has good character development over a long time, every character on that screen will have something going on in their life, right? There'll be a main plot, and then everybody else has a subplot. You might not address every subplot in every episode of that show, but over the course of 2-3 episodes, every subplot will have been touched upon. Everyone will have been advanced, and the characters will grow. And use that as your guideline if you're a GM and you're plotting out a campaign. And again, you have your active players, they're going to design their own. With your more reactive players, you might have to sit down and talk with them more. And then once you kind of figure out what they want, you provide the prompts to move it forward for them, and just give them the things that, they need to do that.
Yeah, give them hard choices to make, or options to choose, and
give them you nudge them. When to nudge them when you need to.
Yeah, I like to do that too, right? If you think of your campaign arc as a through line, right, and that's made up of multiple segments, which are your adventures within that campaign, your big stepping stones, and then you kind of just think of a braid or a weave of all of your characters have their moments, and you have to kind of weave them and give them.
And if you really want to get fancy, because this is what I'm doing with Company of Dragon, have your beloved NPCs have those arcs too.
Oh, that's really good advice for Sandbox, actually. Yeah. Because that makes them feel more dynamic when you don't see them for a few sessions.
It makes the world feel lived in. Or even if it's just, with this instance, with some of those characters, it's, I'll give you a good example. In RuneQuest, we have a character, Amber's character, Rue, had her mom live. Now, Amber is a half-wolf person. Her dad, the character is Rue is a he. So Amber is a player is a she. So I'm just going to refer to Rue as a he. His dad, we'll say, is not a great person, ran off and did some bad stuff. His mom was single for a long time. They wound up going to this place where they met an old flame of the moms. And that kind of rekindled, right? And so there's some growth for them. It's an easy enough thing to role play. You have to talk to yourself a little bit as a GM, but they meet, they're happy. It's something that the players can just witness, but they loved it.
Mm-hmm.
They loved it. So just have those background things.
Amber's very much one of your active players.
Correct.
But it doesn't mean that there aren't moments for her to react as Rue.
Correct.
Because if, for whatever reason, and this could have gone a number of ways, but if you introduce, Rue, your mom is reconnecting with this old flame, and maybe there's a defensiveness, maybe there's a territorial issue, right?
There's, you know what I mean? There's room for role play and growth for the main
over time
for the player character too. Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's great.
Yep. Or just people shipping your NPCs right? Or
Make it happen.
falling in love with them, or make it happen if they do.
Take those notes.
But I will give you again, take notes and draw from television shows where two players are shipped. Make sure it takes as long as possible for them to eventually get together, because you will get people coming back to your table, right? Like, always think of, I think of GMing, I really do compare it a lot to like television series or even comics. Like, if you read a comic, and I've said this before, I think on podcasts too, like, pick something you're into, pick a comic that you're interested in, pick a superhero, and just read a run or two of it, right? Could be an old one, could be a new one, doesn't matter. Every issue has a storyline. There's always a through arc that goes usually 5 issues, because that helps them sell a trade paperback. Yes. But at the end of every issue, there's a cliffhanger, right? Because there's like the villain guy who's going to be the main guy in the next issue. Is like, ha ha ha, Batman, I'm going to do this. And their job is to sell you the next issue, right? Your job as a GM is to get your players to show up to your next session.
Yeah.
So it's the same thought process. Figure out ways to get them to show up to your next. They do that by shipping NPCs and loving it, loving the world, having goals that they're trying to achieve, and all. Sandbox allows all those things.
Yeah.
Right.
It's funny you say that. I had one of my comments in my most recent Mining Media episode about romance and rom-coms was, in a weird way, there's a game called Blue Rose, which is like a romantic age system. Yep. But it actually has really interesting, just like a 2-page spread about romance and how to play it between PCs, between a PC and an NPC. And then there was a section that just said romance between NPCs in your campaign. And I was like, it's weird that they'd include this. But then I read it and I was like, hold on, I think this might be my favorite, because it's just, like you said, it makes the world feel lived in. If they have a connection to one of those PCs but not the other, then there's like this
invested,
thing,
right? Yeah.
And then also, it just gave me the idea that I just now want to have a subplot in any of my games where a player or two, a PC or two, are playing matchmaker for 2 NPCs that they know. Like, isn't that fun?
That's
I feel
great. That's so totally fun. Yeah.
Just a fun, it takes the right kind of game where you're constantly revisiting like a hub or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But man, I was like, now I need to make this happen.
Yeah. It just, again, makes the key to a sandbox is making the world around them feel lived and let them lived in, and being invested in it. Like, whatever you can do to make your players get invested in that world and love it, those are the things you need to be doing, because that's going to drive them to do things.
Yeah, and that actually works very well into my next point, which is it's a sandbox campaign. So unlike a game on rails, players are free to explore. And exploration is a pillar in the world's biggest ampersand that they tout as like a big pillar of this game, but in D&D feels pretty flat.
No,
often.
I mean, not in the way it's played now, honestly. I mean, I will say back when I started
old school
playing,
dungeoning.
It was totally, I mean, that was a pillar. Like, you just leave the town, find the dungeon, explore the wilderness was totally a thing. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, there's a disconnect, in my opinion. And again, I don't want to turn this into a 4-hour podcast where we crap on the Ampersand game as it's published now.
We all know,
because we all know how we feel about it. But there's a huge disconnect between what they say you can do in the game in those books and what they publish as adventures.
Mm-hmm.
And the play loop that they designed doesn't build into what they're talking about with exploration or anything like that. It just doesn't. Sorry.
Yeah, it doesn't feel.
Yeah. No,
it doesn't feel big enough. It doesn't feel important enough. It's mostly just like, and then you arrive here, like set piece, like we said before.
Set piece. There was, it's like you travel 20 days and you get to the place. Well, what happened during those 20 days? There's so much space in there for stuff to happen, and it doesn't have to be like, it doesn't have to be like 4 encounters a day or anything like that. Please don't get me wrong.
Roll a bunch of random encounters.
Yeah, like it could be role playing, character growth. I mean, 20 days is a long time. If you're taking a journey over that broad of a distance that's going to take you 20 days to get from where you are to where you're going, you're going to go through some really different areas, right? Very different cultures, very different experiences. Like, what happened during that time? Why are you glossing over that?
Even if it's not a village, right? Like, if you're in a pretty remote place, maybe you run into a herder. But
we just
let that scene happen.
Like, I read this book about really recently about the English buccaneers, the very first ones who crossed the Darien Peninsula, and they got into the South Sea at the time when Spain was just like absolutely like dominant in that area. So these were the first like pirates in that area, and they sailed up and down the coast of South America, like raiding, and managed to get around the southern tip.
No, that's
Cape Horn.
Africa.
Cape Horn is Africa. No, it's around whatever.
The tip of we're not geographers.
No, we're not geologists. That's a joke. But they managed to get around and sail back into the Atlantic and back to England, right? And I mean, these guys were, again, sailing for like 4, 5, 6 days at a clip to get from one place to another. And the adventure was in the travelogue, in the traveling, and in all the stuff they dealt with, right? To get to where
that's actually really interesting. Yeah.
Right. And it's the same concept. Like, why are you skipping over that? If you wanted to make it into get back to like that adventure book, you leave the coast of Panama and 5 days later you're off the coast of Chile. Okay, but you skip those 5 days and so much could happen in there.
Yeah. For the record, it is Cape Horn.
Cape Horn. Right. We were right.
And unfortunately, in D&D as it's currently written,
Born to be Hanged. Born to be Hanged was the name of the book. I'm sorry.
We got there. Look at that. We ended up correcting both of our.
We did.
But unlike D&D as it's written nowadays, where it's like, every day roll a d20 on a 4 or less, there's an encounter, then roll on this table, and then it's wolves or something, and you're like, that feels super anticlimactic. Instead, and it's unfortunate that they put so much work on the GM. And again, we said sometimes there's a spectrum. Sandboxes are 70-30 players. Railroads are 80-20 DMs. And not everybody wants to put in that 80% work to say they're going on a, let's say, 2 10-day, right? That's a thing in D&D, a 2 10-day journey to come up with maybe not 20 scenes to have over the course of every day, but even say 5, right? 5 that don't feel stale, 5 that, you know what I mean? Like, it shouldn't be your job to do that, right? No. Like the game, if it touts exploration as a thing, should provide you opportunities to say, you meet travelers, you do a scene around the campfire at night on watch, you do have an encounter, but make it meaningful to the thing that you are doing and not just a random monster that lives in this biome. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But sandboxes actually are incredible for exploration if you seed the world with things your players have hinted at.
Correct. Or they want, right? And your players ultimately, it's a truism, but it's a truism because it's true. Your players tell you what they want to play based upon the characters that they make. Even if they never sit down and say, this is what I want to do, you can tell by the character that they make what they want to engage in that world.
Like they say, one of the best ways to be good at conversation is to be a good listener.
Yep.
One of the best ways to be a good GM is to sit back and listen to your players.
Yeah. And honestly, like, I think there's a lot to be said for having those conversations with your players and be like, hey, what do you want to see?
Yeah.
What do you want to engage in? What's interesting to you? What do you want for your character? We'll get there. Maybe not in the way you anticipate all the time, but we will get there. And we'll make we'll give you those moments.
I'm not going to tee up your exact scenes as you're giving them to me, but I'm going to make you earn them,
Right.
Like Amber says, as an author, she always says, give your character something they want and something they need. Mm-hmm. Those two things should not be achieved the same way, or
not at all. Yeah.
So, and as a GM, if you're paying attention, or if you have those conversations out of game or even in game with your players, you can all of a sudden that prompt list just populated itself. You just have to come up with a couple set pieces and don't make them like railroads in that scene, but make them make a decision,
Make them make a decision is key. And it's, I'll talk again because I'm kind of neck deep in it right now with Company of Dragon. Like, we talk about this. It's a game where you're fighting an oppressive regime and you're trying to get it out of your country, right? But the how of it, I've left entirely up to them. And they've taken it in directions that I have never expected. And I've just honestly been like, there's a question here that is always like, there's a fear or a criticism of sandboxes where it's like, the GM has to like almost prepare more than they would for a railroad, because it's like, well, if anybody can do anything, then I have to be prepared for everything, right? Mm-hmm. What if they go to this town and I'm going to need stat blocks for these guys or whatever? First of all, you don't need stat blocks for everyone. Like, just throw that idea right out the window. Honestly, if I usually it's like I realize I need a stat block for someone and then I make it after the fact, because it's like, oh, this person is going to stick around a while. I'm going to need this. I better make something. Or if I'm like, hey, I have someone who I want to make a good villain, I'll have a stat block for them.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I can decide this person's going to be around to be a thorn in their side. So I know I'm going to use this eventually. I might not use it the way I expect, but I'm going to have it and I'm going to use it. And that's the key, I think, for preparation with sandboxes, is that first thing is you don't need to prepare as much as you think, because you really only need to be maybe a session 2 at most ahead of your players.
Yeah, you start planning too far in a sandbox.
It's not going to, then you're wasting.
They're not going to get to that point.
Yep.
They've veered off.
It's going to change. They veered off. You really, I'm finding a session and a half ahead. Like I have a solid idea of the next session and then some vague ideas beyond that. And it's really the next session. My planning is, what are the consequences of the actions they took this session?
Yeah.
What's the reaction? The world just reacts to what they do.
And that's not to say in your prep for a sandbox game, don't know the major players.
Correct.
Do know the powers.
Know all that stuff.
Yeah.
Know how they would react. And I think importantly, this gets to a good point. Know what their plans are, right? Yeah. So your good bad guy is not sitting in a dungeon in room D12 waiting to be stabbed. He's out there doing stuff.
Eating grapes all day, every day.
Yeah, right. Like, being fed grapes by attractive drow. Right. But they have plans and they're out there doing stuff to accomplish their plans, and you need to know the steps they're going to take. I think that's probably really important. These are the steps that they're going to take to accomplish their plan, and the players can insert themselves anywhere along that place to fuck those plans up.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's conflict. If the players do nothing, this gets back to like your question about dithering right before.
Yep.
Things get worse because the bad guys start accomplishing their plans.
Yeah, exactly.
The longer they delay, the more bad. The badder it gets. And they now have more to deal with. And I'll give a really good example just recently. You can go back and you can listen to this because I'm going to look it up right now. It's on our YouTube channel. It was in an episode of DMs After Dark, the RuneQuest campaign, just recently, where we had this setup where they're trying to help with this siege of this sacred castle. And the Lunars are all around it. The Lunars are the bad guys in this instance. And there's a river, and the Lunars had a shaman capture the river spirit. Everything has a spirit in RuneQuest.
Yep.
The river had a spirit, and they captured her and locked her in this like cave, her natural grotto where she lived, and there was a demon guarding her. And so they went in and they fought the demon, and they killed it, freed the river spirit. She was very happy. And then they were all kind of like standing around being like, well, what do we do next? And they're having this whole discussion, and it started going in circles, and I was getting a little antsy, and I was like, you know what? A lunar shaman is going to know if one of their bindings is broken. Guess what? Her raven familiar showed up and now clocked all you guys and knows your faces, and they've got people coming after you now. You have to know when your players start to kind of like dither or think they have more time than they really do. You got to nudge them a little bit.
Yeah.
And the world has to start moving around them and reacting to what they did, so they know they have to move on to the next thing.
Yes. In that criticism, which is easy to lose the thread, always have something applying pressure, right? And if you don't have anything in the moment, move one of those plans along, right? And
move one of the plans along. Exactly.
Make it feel felt in the world.
It is. I'm trying to. It was Session 8, The Demon and the River Goddess. If you want to go on our YouTube and find it, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You can watch me do that real time and just be like, okay, guys, there's a raven watching you now.
Yep.
What are you going to do? Yeah.
Now, there is we talked a little bit about this because the social contract, but building on players having more authorial control than in maybe usual games, even if you trust your players, it could be a slippery slope, right? To let them fully have the wheel and the gas, right? If all you have is the brakes,
really
right?
Scary sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I know we've been talking a lot about RuneQuest, but like we said at the very top of this episode, we play a lot of games. Like we it's hard for us to play a game and not think about all the other games and mechanics we know and be like, I can make this better with this thing from this other thing, and we Frankenstein stuff.
Yes, we do.
But do you think...
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Do you think for sandboxes, maybe this is too easy of a question, but like, do you think that system matters? Like, do you think you can sandbox any system? Or do you think that certain mechanics work better for sandbox games than other games?
I would say that I think it's ultimately probably a matter of personal taste as the GM, right? So for me, we've played one shots, which you can go and find, and you've been involved in them, Rene, where
we do a lot of one shots.
We start with nothing, right? And we just build the game together. So clearly all of us are very comfortable giving each other the wheel when we need to. I think when you're playing a one shot, there's a lot less kind of investment on everyone's part to kind of fight for a particular vision.
Yeah.
So I don't think first of all, I don't think you can ever fully give your players the wheel, right? If you're running a campaign that's a sandbox, you just can't do it. You can you sort of give them the wheel, because you're in charge of refereeing the world, right? And so
it's a student driver car.
Right. If someone comes up with something that just doesn't fit, you have to veto it. You ultimately have a veto power. Whether or not you should use that all the time, that's up to you. I think it should always be a matter of, if you can't give them something, you have to give them half of what they want, or a portion of it at least, because nobody wants to be told no all the time, right? Yeah. And also, people who don't discourage players from having ideas, because that's how you wind up with passive players. So you have to help them, but sometimes they might be like, "Oh, I want to do this," and you're just like, "No, Troy, a Glock doesn't exist in this world," or something like that, right? So I personally,
it's a spirit Glock.
It's a spirit Glock. In system-wise, I don't think I would want to run a sandbox game in a very crunchy system.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, that's funny, because someone could look at RuneQuest with like a 460-page rule book and be like, "What are you talking about, you moron?" And they'd be correct, honestly. It's a pretty crunchy system to do this. But there are ways of kind of like paring things down when you need to, if you really need to, to do it. But I'm thinking of something like Pathfinder, right? I would never in my life run a Pathfinder one, or like Shadowrun. I just wouldn't do it, because it's just too much. You have to, unless you know the system well enough to just like do that stuff on the spot.
Yeah.
I personally wouldn't want to do it. Somebody else out there might be like, "Hey, yeah, I could do that." So I think maybe Rules Light lends itself more and better to that stuff. Because I can talk about when we played a Fate superhero game, for instance. Fate is a very simple game to just stat things on the fly. So if someone's just like, "Oh, I want to go and do this," you can just be like, "Cool, let's do it." Quest Worlds, which Chaosium just came out with, similar sort of idea, right? Kind of a generic system. Very simple, very easy to come up with things on the fly. There are all sorts of systems out there that you can do that. They might, I think, be a little better in the long run.
Fate actually even has a lot of player-facing authorial moves, like making aspects and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah. That's true. I was going to say, I think that the answer to that is too easily no. Like, does system matter? I think yes, right? I don't think you can run any game as a sandbox. There's too many, especially now, there's too many games that emulate a very specific
very specific
genre
sort of thing.
or experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's true. I think that and that actually maybe feels like it balances that fear of, I need to prep too much, or I need to think of every possible potential thing, because my players can do anything. But if you dial it back and you say like, well, go more rules light with the system, now you don't have to worry so much about doing things on the fly.
When we ran, and I did a Fate superhero campaign, a very kind of a 12 session one. It wasn't a long campaign, but it was long enough, and I was always very comfortable going into that session to be able to just roll with whatever people came up with, because it was very simple to just be like, "Oh, okay." And here's another thing. Here's a secret. If you are doing it with a more crunchy system and prep, and Kevin Crawford also, by the way, like Stars Without Numbers, Rules Without Numbers, all that stuff. He's the guy to get advice on sandboxes for. And one of his bit of advice is like, none of the prep you have. First of all, if you're doing prep and you're not having fun, don't do it. I think that's a great rule, right? If you're running a sandbox, or just as a GM in general, if you're doing prep that you're not enjoying, stop doing that prep, like right away. Stop it. You should be having fun doing this. It shouldn't be something that feels like a job. Secondly, unless you're getting paid to do it, you're a paid GM, then maybe you do it. I don't know. If you're like a masochist. Secondly,
I'd hope you still have fun with that, though.
Yeah, hopefully, right? Secondly, no work you've ever done is truly wasted, because the players don't see the prep you do. So if you prep the whole town, like a whole mining town in an Old West game with like an innkeeper and all this stuff, and they don't even go to that town, guess what? All the guys you prepped are just in the next town they go to. Right? Yeah. You just move that stuff over. Or if you built this really cool villain and then you never fought him, but you're really happy with the stuff you built, guess what? The next guy could just have stuff. Just reskin it a little bit. You don't have to waste that stuff. You just use it again.
I saw a really funny meme where it was like beginner GM notes, and it was like a few words on a Post-it note. Yeah. And then it was like intermediate GM notes, and it was like a huge Google Doc of like all these things. Yep. And then it said advanced GM notes, and it was a few words on a sticky note again.
And it's like the words are like pickle ?
Yeah. Right? Goblin, pickle goblin? Like
pickle goblin? We're rolling with it.
Well, obviously, you've been running a Sandbox campaign for a little while now. Company of the Dragon's still pretty new, so people can definitely catch up on it pretty quickly. So, but you've got your experience. You've what's the word? Something your chops. I don't know. Anyway,
I don't know. Made my bones. But we'll use a mob term. I made my bones.
You've made your bones.
I made your bones.
But if you don't mind, can I bring up something that we've talked about maybe a couple of years now?
Yes. Yeah.
But it's finally, I think, coming to fruition.
Very close to fruition. Yep.
Yeah. I've been playtesting it, which is crazy.
So cool.
We're making a Sandbox RPG.
We are. Yep. Yes, we are.
And it is very different, if I may say so, because, the two of us, like we said, we play a lot of games, and we were like, well, we don't want to just reinvent the wheel. But how do you feel about approaching design with your experience running Sandbox games affected how you want this one to play?
So it's a weird thing because, like, I've run games as a GM now very publicly. I've written them now and published them, and those two things are very different.
Yeah,
right? And there's a very different the way I approach planning for a session with the people I know I'm playing with is very, very different from the way I approach writing something that's going to be given to people who I don't know who are going to play it.
Yeah, can't expect their behaviors
you can't
know
expect
their style.
Behaviors. It's too easy. With you writing for your friends, you're just like, I know this one's going to bite on this hook, and I know this, and I'm going to throw this in because I know this one likes this, and that's what you wind up doing. You don't know that with you're writing for an unknown quantity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Quality rather. So
both.
Yeah, both. So yes, in a way, because the key thing about a sandbox, which is very similar to writing any scenario that other people are going to pick and play, is that you don't have control over it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's very much an element of, which is a very good advice for any sort of adventure design. If you're out there, even just at your own table, just write the beginning.
Yeah.
And it's up for everyone else to come up with the middle and the end. You can have some ideas about how that could go, but it's really up to them.
I like the idea that, this, I'm going to actually say something that I don't think we've considered for this game, but I do like the idea of games should hint at what the end looks like.
Right. I think that's fair. I think that's 100% fair, because you have an idea of something to strive for, right?
Yeah. What are we acting towards?
Yeah, well, you might have no idea, right? You might come into a genre, of game where you're not familiar with its tropes, and you're just like, okay, well, what am I expecting to do here? And sometimes, by the way, coming into a genre with like not understanding its tropes can be cool, because you wind up with some really iconic stuff. So if you're playing in playing in like a cyberpunk game, right, and you've got someone who's like no idea what cyberpunk is, and they wind up not playing like this cynical hard, kind of like cynical hardboiled character, but they come up with someone who's like a super optimist, right? Doesn't fit into that.
Who are
at
you?
all.
Where did you come from?
But it'll wind up being a great character, right?
100%. How are you going to forget that person?
Because they break that mold. So yeah. I think hinting at the end is good, as long as you give people room to express it and get there in their own way, or create their own ending that might be better.
For sure, yeah. And I think that I think that for good reason we have not talked about what the end of our game looks like.
Because I think with ours, and we probably need to say what it is in a minute.
Yeah, let's talk about what it is.
Yeah, but I think with ours, the real reason for that is that I think it's very important for everyone to be able to pick it up and decide what their own ending looks like.
Yeah, and it also matters because
it's ultimately a utopian thing, right? And everyone gets to define that for themselves.
Yeah, so we are designing a game, and if you've listened to the DMs of the Dark, you've heard us talk about this a time or two, and I've probably mentioned it on this podcast as well, but Christian and I are very close to finalizing our quick start, and the master doc is quite a bit larger, but getting there, of a game of post-catastrophe, community rebuilding, and survival, where the only true premise at the beginning of this game is that the power has gone out and it is not coming back. Basically, at one day you lost power, and if you're like me, you go, shoot, all right, I'll go start a fire or whatever, or like, you know what I mean, like grab stuff, like keep the fridge closed or whatever. And I like a year and a half ago experienced like 4 or 5 days without power.
Brutal.
That sucked.
I've done
dude.
the same. Yeah.
And like 4 or 5 days sucked. we pick up this game and say, it's been like 6 months.
Yep.
We skip over a lot of very bad things that would happen in those 6 months. But another thing that I love about this Sandbox game is that ideally we're asking people to go pick up a road atlas or a road map of your local region, your state, whatever it may be. There's your map. You are familiar with your hex map, or you are familiar with your sandbox, but we're going to ask you to make a mess of it a little bit and then think about it in a very different way than your normal work commute or what have you, right? I think that helps in my mind. Yeah. I hope that makes people feel more excited and like more able to engage with the world immediately, that I think could be really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And again, we play a lot of games, and I found that it's always easier to rope someone in who's a total noob to a game that's set in our world.
Mm-hmm.
You can take that and spin it off to any crazy ass thing you want. You can turn it into Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, although I've never played those games. That's interestingly the gap in my gaming resume is I have not played any of the
I've never played a single World of Darkness game.
Me neither. But I'm familiar with them, and I'm familiar with one of their tenets, which is always create your own world of darkness in your hometown. Which I think was a great thing, was what informed this. But even Call of Cthulhu, like, it works really well to be like modern Call of Cthulhu scenarios. It's great because you're like, you have a cell phone, you have this, you have that. You can interact in the world any way you're familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's this crazy ass shit going on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And for someone, particularly for people who aren't, maybe are newer to the hobby or whatever, that's something that I found is very easy for them to engage with, because they're not having to learn all these like fantasy tropes or imagine themselves in a world, or kind of like get into a headspace for a different world.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. How does society work in this cyberpunk dystopia again?
Right, exactly. Not that differently sadly from ours, but
yeah. And actually, I'd love to say like, well, people know how society works in our world, but like then we go, well, the power's out and it's been 6 months. And
yeah.
So it doesn't look like it does now.
But the idea is think about natural disasters that have occurred recently, right? Like the flooding we had in the Appalachians, or hurricanes, a hurricane in New Orleans, or these natural wildfires out west, where you see sometimes the best and the worst in people, because there are looters and there are awful people, but then there are also people who are like kind of like banding together and helping each other. But there's always this idea of like, well, help's just a little bit away because the National Guard's going to show up and this is going to happen and that's going to show up. But what if they never do?
Yeah. Right.
And what if slowly, because the idea is slowly, unless it's broadcast on the news that the world ended, right? If there's like that EMP blast that like, all the electronics just fry, you're not going to hear it. You're just going to think your power's out.
Yeah.
And you're going to wait for someone to come. And then there's going to be a realization that no one's coming. And then what do you do? And that's the game.
And that's the game.
How do you rebuild your world? How do you rebuild society?
Yeah. Yes. And I love the idea of, I think that, so we built this game to have exploration phase, like a player phase, right? Where you're embodying a PC and you're exploring a world you're relatively familiar with and thinking of it in a different way. Obviously, natural disasters and problems that have arisen in the last few months. Maybe somebody set a fire and now all of a sudden like half of a neighborhood that you are very familiar with is gone. Or like, you know what I mean? Like dams were on these electronic sensors to let out amounts of water when certain things happen. But when those sensors went down, entire counties flooded or something like that, right?
No. Or
like I know in Rhode Island, if the Scituate Reservoir, if we let all the water out of the Scituate Reservoir, there'd be a massive swamp and a lot of people would be out of fresh water, right? Like, I mean, like that complicates a lot of other things. So, you have those problems going on. So you're dealing with that in the player phase, going out exploring, right? Exploring is one of the big things in a sandbox, and you get to see how the world is reacting to when you and your friends and your community are making certain things happen. And there are definitely powers and other factions around the world or around your region that are going to be reacting to these things. And then something that I think is going to play really well in a sandbox is our other phase is the community phase, which zooms out to your little community. And you just have to make a few like resource management decisions that inform your next player phase. And it almost kind of takes a step back. And like this game is designed to be played with the GM and players, but there's almost like a GM-less portion. So the GM can kind of just like sit back and be like, all right, who's doing what? And just kind of like, mess with stuff. So it's kind of neat.
Yeah, I love as a GM, that's one of my favorite things to do is just be like, okay, what are you guys doing? And just sit back and let your players do stuff for a while. But also when they're doing that stuff, and I think that's the key here, them doing those things gives you the seeds you need for the future exploration and adventure stuff, because they're going to be like, we need this, we need that, we need more seeds, we need to get to the dam and somehow turn on turn on those sensors again, or blow the whole dam, or whatever they might need to do. They need to get back and do that thing. All right, well, there's a quote unquote adventure, right? I'm a huge fan of characters having a reason to go do things, like a real legitimate reason that's tied to the actual world beyond just I want to kill the monster and take its stuff, right?
Yeah.
So this is something that is just going to be a machine for generating that, where they're okay, we want this, so we need to go get this, so we need to go get that. And think about like if you played at Valheim, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't played it, pick it up. It's one of the best indie games ever made. Like huge game on Steam, but you build a base. And then it's like, okay, I need this thing. You got to go get that thing. I need this thing. And there's this endless loop of like going and getting the resource, coming back to your base, making your base better, making your stuff better. And it's very addictive. And there's this wonderful kind of like pastoralism of like, hey, our base is so cool. Let's hang out in our base for a while.
Yeah.
But then eventually you need to go back out in the world and do more stuff. Right. But you're always doing it for a reason. And so that's the same idea with this game, which we have tentative titles for. That's why we haven't titled it yet.
Yeah. Every time I bring up the title, I'm always like, no, I need a new one.
Yeah, we do.
But can you tell we're forever GMs? Because like we mechanized a whole phase that was just like, hey, give us ideas. Like, hey, seed your own adventures, right?
You
and
just
then I
do
just
stuff
get to,
and we'll sit here and take down notes.
and the nice thing about a TTRPG is, right, like obviously it's very easy to always keep that resource need there, and that's always going to be a potential adventure, a potential reason to go out on an errand out into the rust and do what you're going to do. Or you can have NPC quarrels, you can have another faction, you can have another comm, you can have people coming from another comm because they're fleeing poor management and they need a place to stay. Do you have the means to take on these extra people? Can you ramp up production? You know what I mean? Like,
you turn them away, right?
Yeah. So it's really fun. It's really exciting. And you know what? This is what I've been doing, Christian, is I've been promising things in a recording to hold myself to it.
It's the best way to do things. Yeah, it is.
So we are now on the hook for, I'm going to say late summer, maybe mid-summer.
I think we can get like a quick
start out there.
A quick start out, but for sure.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. Sometime this year.
I'm committed.
The quick start will be out. Yeah.
There we go. We'll both commit to it. That way we both said it now.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and segue to our closing questions for this interview.
Sure.
And I always ask the same 3 questions. And I can't wait to hear yours on this first one. Do you have any last bits of advice, wisdom, or homework for the listeners?
Oh, God. I think I feel like I've said a lot of good stuff, honestly.
So you got to give them homework. I want people to give homework.
So, all right, I will. So first off, I'm going to say the best bit of advice I think I can give for a sandbox or any jamming really is like consequences of your players' actions. Like that will take you so far. Mm-hmm. It's such a simple thing, and then cause and effect will take you so far. Right?
Ripples of a butterfly wing or whatever, right?
Ripples in a pond, or butterfly flaps its wings, whatever you want to call it.
Mixing my metaphors.
It'll take you very far. Whenever you're stuck, what are the consequences of my player's actions? That will get you over wherever you're stuck on. For homework, I would challenge you to either binge watch a show or read a comic series, whichever you prefer. Right? Just pick one and read it, or watch a good Netflix series, something you like. You will learn a tremendous amount about character and story development from a well-done show or comic. That's your homework.
Yeah, watch it with a different lens, as not just entertainment, right? But
watch it and imagine it's actually a campaign.
Yeah.
And then be like, well, how did they do this from behind the scenes, right? How did the GM and the players make that happen if it's a campaign? Watch it and imagine it that way. I love that. Yeah, that's That's pretty much how I engage and indulge. I mean, that's honestly, I do, and I try not to consciously, but I do. Right.
Yeah.
Like I try
Right.
not to engage. I try to just like sit down and enjoy something.
Turn that off.
But then I find myself being like, oh, but wait. And yeah, I just find myself doing that naturally now.
All right. Question number 2. Christian, are there any games you're excited to try or ideas you want to get out and try at the table?
So yeah, a game I'm really excited to try that's been out for a while now, but I've backed a new Kickstarter of expansions to it because that guy is. I really want to play Old Gods of Appalachia.
Oh yeah, dude.
Yeah, I really
that
do.
podcast just came back recently. They're in the 80s now. It's awesome.
So cool. Oh, they're in the 80s. That's
yeah,
awesome.
Dude, they time jumped. So that's why I said hop back in because
I gotta hop back in because when I was listening, I had the whole idea of like modern version of this would like slap hard.
Oh, dude, it's awesome.
Yeah, but I loved the book when it came out. I got a physical copy of the book. I loved what they did. I'll admit to being skeptical that the cipher system was going to work with it.
Same.
But they did a good job of it, in my opinion. They really honored the source material, and I'm excited. They've got a couple new books coming out. Like I think it's a short campaign and like just some different character options and stuff that I backed. And I haven't had a chance to play it yet. And that's a game I really want to play. Something I'm excited to try out at the table. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, like if it's like a character or like something that like a seed, like I was just saying, like one of the things I want to do now is like have like a matchmaking subplot or something like that. Like any little thing.
Some of that. I have some of that ongoing right now, actually, in my own stuff already. The little NPC ships. I actually have a file in my computer where I have like when I have the campaign notes, I just have a rune. It's called the RuneQuest ship list, and it's just the NPCs and who they may or may not wind up with and how to torture my players with it.
Wonderful.
So I'm going to use more of that, definitely. I'm excited to have. We haven't had many of them, to be honest with you. So I'm excited to have within RuneQuest some more. Like we've done some very basic ones when we did 6 Seasons of Sartar, but some bigger, more important Hero Quest stuff, like some weird shit.
Yeah. Yes.
Which we should have coming up soon. Like some
they are so
weird
cool.
Shit. Yeah.
That's like a whole phase of a mechanic of a system that is honestly like it's such a cool
cool
part
idea
of that game.
For anyone who doesn't know what a Hero Quest is, it's basically going into mythic time and changing it and coming back like empowered by myth, but actually like encountering the gods. So almost like a shamanic journey, like a vision quest or a really bad trip maybe, but it's kind of something like that, but coming back with something concrete, right? Like a supernatural power or changing the world in some way, shape, or form by doing this thing. And the beauty of it within the rule system is, and the joke in the community is like, well, the hero questing rules are coming out next year, and that's been true for 50 years now. And the truth of the matter is, honestly, They've promised that they'll be written again. I hope they never come out, because the problem is they're pretty much guaranteeing disappointment by publishing actual rules, because by now everybody has their own idea about it. And the cool thing about it is you really just break the rules when you do it.
It's permission to break the rules.
It's permission to break the rules. So there's no real way in my mind to codify that at a gaming table. So I don't know how they're ever going to do it. But I want to do some more of that real weird shit.
Heck yeah.
Because I live for that. Yeah.
All right, Christian. What do you want to pitch, and where can people find you out there on the interwebs?
So you can find us at DMs After Me, at DMs After Dark, anywhere there's social media. And you can I'll pitch my newest Call of Cthulhu scenario, Deadfellas, which is a 1980s homage to all the really good mob movies, like Goodfellas, but other ones as well, like Donnie Brasco, but in a Call of Cthulhu framework. So you can find that on Drive-Thru-RPG. Deadfellas is his name. Check it out. Just came out. And let me know what you think.
Yeah. Well, again, it'll be in the description. And Christian, this was so overdue, one. And two, totally. It's good to just sit down and talk games with you, my dude.
We don't do it enough. And I think that we need to do this again sometime real soon. I know
we do it nonstop,
like, super far.
Texting each other.
No, but it's not the same.
It's not the same. It's not the same.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, man, thank you so much. And everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Go catch up on Company of the Dragon. Go check out Deadfellas. And see you, bud.
Take care, buddy.
And thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this interview and have new ideas for how to run sandboxes at your table. I'm going to keep the end super short today You know where to find me out there on the internet. Just search for Rene Plays Games, or if you want, make sure you're following the DMs After Dark as well. They are my OG streaming and games on the internet homies, so they're keeping up their RuneQuest campaigns. I know we've been talking a little bit about getting me back in for a couple of sessions of that with the character that I created at the beginning of RuneQuest and then had to dip out of for scheduling reasons. And yeah, they have an insane backlog. You can actually find some old solo stuff of mine. I convinced the other DMs to play some solo games of their own. So there's a lot of content out there from us for you to enjoy. If you want to reach out to me directly, feel free to email me at readyplaysgamespod@gmail.com. I've been getting more emails and they're so awesome to get and hear from people and just chat. And if you want to be on an episode of Perspective Checks or have a game you'd like to do a tabletop tutorial on, please let me know. Alright, that's it. So until next time, scatter some stories around your sandbox, let your players in there to mess with what they will, and see what happens.